is Malcolm Moran. I'm the Knight Chair in Sports Journalism and Society here at Penn State, and also the director of the John Curley Center for Sports Journalism. Very briefly, I just wanted to offer a description of what we have planned for this evening and how you would be an important part of it. You meaning those of you that are here in Schwab Auditorium, and also those of you that are observing this online through our streaming feed, and thanks to you for taking the time as well. A couple of words about respect and sensitivity that are very important to this. Roughly a decade ago, when Dean Doug Anderson of the College of Communications and John Curley, who was then on the faculty here after being the first editor of USA Today, conceived the idea of having a Center for Sports Journalism to create an academic approach for the study of the sports journalism industry. It was the first campus in America that had this idea. And this, what was then known as the Center for Sports Journalism, was formed in 2003. I think it's safe to say that it has never been more relevant or significant in the days following November 5th forward. And so what we're here for, thanks to our guests, is a chance to take a deep breath, take a step back for a moment after everything that has happened in the discussion within this campus community, for some insight, for some context, and for some understanding of what must be the most complex story that many of us have viewed in our lifetimes professionally. And so there's going to be opinion, because some of us are paid to offer opinion. You may not agree with all of them, but the hope is that there'll be an honest give and take, and that we'll be able to take advantage of the chance to develop some insight. Under the heading of sensitivity, I still feel guilty when I even think about any other aspects other than the core issue of the young people whose lives were affected. So just for the record, anything we say or discuss is done within the context that within our hearts, first, last, and always, the victims are in our thoughts. And I think you would share that thought with all of us. To thank our guests in alphabetical order, you already have the bios that have been handed out, so you know all about them and their achievements. I just wanted to offer up one brief description for each of them. The dots that are connected here is that each of our guests have achieved at a high level, but have also done things to extend themselves to student journalists, both on this campus and elsewhere. Christine Brennan is a force of nature. I have been observing this for a very long time. I'm biased because she's my friend, but she has done as much to mentor young journalists as any single person I know, and I watched that unfold again on this campus about 3 hours ago, talking with some students. Sarah Ganem, at a very young age, taught this past spring semester, so there will be students one day that, as part of the legend, will say that Sarah Ganem taught me, but she just wasn't Sarah Ganem yet. But yes, I did have her class. Jerry Micco has been extremely generous with students in the Curley Center. He's a former president of the Associated Press Sports Editors, and he conceived this idea of what he called a reverse panel when the APSC Mid-Atlantic region would meet on campus. And his idea was you would have a collection of panelists of students that would be asking questions of the sports editors in attendance. And the nicest thing was it wasn't job applicant to potential boss, it was more like the spirit of niece or nephew speaking to a concerned relative, and Jerry deserves all the credit for that. Mark Vieira posed a challenge for me that I may not ever have teaching at this university, and that is, what do you do when an undergraduate in a journalism course, while that course is happening, on the biggest Sunday of the football season in college football, has front page bylines in the sports sections of the Sunday New York Times and Washington Post on the same day? The answer is you get out of the way. And so I have experience in getting out of the way, and so that's what I'm going to do. And as far as our engagement, to involve you, Shortly after we get started, we have microphones in the front. And those of you who are in my sports writing classes, remember that class when I was really annoying and I walked around with the microphone and you had to stand up and introduce yourself the way you had to in a press conference? Well, this is what that was for. We didn't know it yet, but we invite your questions. And also, Steve Bien-Aimé, who is a former editor of both newspapers and websites, will be checking online to see the questions that are coming from there, and the most thought-provoking ones will be part of our discussion. So, as you will be able to tell very quickly, this is unscripted, unrehearsed. It's really whatever direction the conversation leads us, and that includes your involvement too in your questions. So, Sarah, since you were out front of this in May, as far as you feel comfortable discussing, could you just, for the sake of context, describe the first pieces of information that you had way back when that led you and your editors to pursue this unfolded story?
Sure. Well, I first heard about this story when I was a crime reporter for the Center Daily Times, which most of you hopefully know is the local paper here. That was back in 2009. And at that point, what I knew was just a very small fraction of what we are reporting now. I heard some rumors, some people were talking about it, not nearly enough to go with a story. But, you know, I was a crime reporter, so this was a crime story for me, and I followed the facts like I would any other crime story. I was telling someone earlier today, it really wasn't until this month that I realized that there was a big side story to this story. But I mean, it might be a little embarrassing to say, but for a good 2 years, to me, this was just a story about a crime, an alleged crime. But just like every other alleged crime story that I report in my job as a crime reporter, and I think that what happened in November to spin this story into the scope that it is really something that I don't know if I won't speak for everybody, but it was a shock a little bit to, at least to me as a reporter. Did not see that coming. But, my focus the whole time has been, this is primarily a story about a crime. And the stuff on the side is interesting, of course, but this is really a story about a crime. So I don't know if that goes beyond your question, but...
No, I mean, it's very helpful. And one other piece of information that can help you out in terms of your questions, the reason that we're sitting in the order that we're sitting is just to remind you that on this side, we have reporters who have been reporting this story, but really aren't in a position to offer the kind of opinion that a columnist would. On the other side, Jerry and Christine, Christine is paid for her opinions, and that's her job. And although Jerry is an assistant managing editor for sports, he has the vehicle of offering an opinion in chat room discussions. And Jerry, one thing I wanted to get your take on, and this is one of the more disturbing elements of this, when you had the experience recently where you reminded people in a chat room of a Post-Gazette chat that there is a presumption of innocence, there is a legal process that will, we hope, bring facts to light in time. And you were attacked for that. I mean, could you describe what you experienced?
Well, I think as journalists, we all try to approach things in a way that we want to know what's going on, and we want to make sure we're ready to go with the story. As Sarah said, and she's been way ahead of everyone on this story, you can't print everything you get. I think that's just a basic tenet. You're not sure, and you've got to be very careful. And I think sometimes in this story, and it happens in other stories, but in this one, because it's so unusual, and it's so unusual, and as I was telling some of these folks earlier, it's the most divisive story I've ever been involved in, and I've been a sports editor all over the country for the last 22 years. There's very little gray area. So if you would say something like, hey, look, there's a presumption of innocence here, that you can't just write a news story or a story that says so-and-so did this, or this, we know this to be true, or unless you've got it backed up. And I just what you want to do is put the brakes on just a little bit I think journalistically, we've maybe done that a little bit. And, you know, people are like, well, you know, I guess you don't care about child molestation. I guess you don't care that this went on at Penn State. It's like, well, that's not the case at all. I'm an alumni of Penn State, alumnus, I'm sorry, of Penn State. Yeah, I mean, you care first and foremost. Anyone's ever read that grand jury report is sickened by it, what you read, if you've got a heart, and everyone does. You know, I think the idea, though, for journalists is to try to keep it, it's a process. And for the reporters, Mark and Sarah, it's a process. You're following leads, you're chaining together facts. This is what reporters do. Editors question that, and they say, okay, well, what about this? What about that? That's what we do. Christine has to form opinions on this, and there's a lot coming at columnists, too. And, you know, columnists get this all the time for everything. This is what when you put your opinion out there, this is what happens. So, yeah, it's difficult. Sure it is, but it's part of what we do. It's a story. It's not going away anytime soon. And I'd imagine that there'll be more of that. But I think, for me, as an editor, I want to make sure we have the right context and the types of stories that we're doing. So that's basically the way I try to approach it.
Christine, you bring the unique vantage point of columnist for a national publication, but also you are a trustee. I mean, you're a trustee at your alma mater, Northwestern University, so unlike most journalists, you know what happens in the room. Now, even though Northwestern is a different type of institution, if a similar situation had somehow developed at Northwestern, what type of advocacy would your voice bring to the discussion inside the room, particularly as far as the issue of transparency, which is one of the things that's been discussed here?
It's a great question, Malcolm. If this were to happen at Northwestern, my alma mater, I would immediately resign from the Board of Trustees to be able to continue to do my job as a journalist. And in fact, my colleague Mike Wilbon and I were both from the same class, the class of 1980, and we're both on the Board of Trustees at Northwestern. And we have talked often about just that issue. And as you get a little older and you're so involved with the university, as I am with Northwestern, mentoring our women student athletes as well as our journalism students, and so associated with the university, it got to the point where I thought I could make that leap. But it is not done lightly as a journalist, and it's for this exact reason, because I want to be able to write and talk on television as well, and on the radio too, in as unencumbered a voice as I can. And I feel I've done that because I've basically just stayed in my role as a journalist and not even given really a second thought to what I would do as a trustee. And as I said, it sounds like a joke, but it really isn't, I would resign immediately because I'd want to be as clear from a scandal like this as possible and keep my, obviously the thing that is nearest and dearest to my heart, which is my opportunity to be a journalist and continue to do that. But where I feel, Malcolm, to answer your question, where I feel most informed, I think, is not so much even as a trustee, but just as someone who has lived life and who says to themselves when they see the university president. I was in Toledo, actually, my hometown, doing some speeches and saw the news break, as I'm sure many of you did on Saturday, and went to some news stories immediately online and started to read up before I read the grand jury report. And I saw President Spanier's comments, in which he, of course, said the now infamous words that he gave his unconditional support to Mr. Curley and Mr. Schultz. And even more important for me was looking at the word he used about those 23 awful pages that you mentioned, Jerry, the grand jury report, using the word groundless. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I've covered Tanya Nancy. I broke the Lake City scandal in 2002. I've covered the baseball steroid story. We have Pedro Gomez here from ESPN, and Pedro's covered that story beautifully for years. I've also been on top of the steroid story, really not because I wanted to, but because it happened in front of me at the Seoul Olympics in 1988, when we were in the Press Tribune right at the finish line watching Ben Johnson win the Olympic gold medal, and 3 days later he was stripped of that gold medal because of a positive drug test, and we were off and running on the story of our lives, so we thought, the steroid story in sports. So for me, Malcolm, it's much more that these 30 years of being a journalist and a sports journalist and watching these scandals unfold and seeing what I thought were the biggest stories I've ever seen, and then immediately being in the neighboring state in Ohio, my hometown, and in Toledo, and watching this story, reading a few stories and saying, I think this is bigger than anything we've ever seen. So that's really kind of where I come from on this.
Okay. Mark was one of the first people that got to town, early Sunday morning or Saturday night?
I think it was around 12:30 in the morning on Sunday.
So Sunday the 6th a.m.
Yes.
In the Curley Center, we talk a lot about relationships and how they're formed professionally as far as the flow of information. And Mark is not a full-time staff member, but you would not know that from his work in the New York Times. A lot of people were parachuting in here that had never been here before. You knew your way around because you've lived here. So is there a way that you could describe the advantage that gave you when you're hurrying to try and collect information, knowing who to approach, knowing the terrain? I mean, how were you able to get information from that?
It was invaluable. I knew who to go to. I knew who would be in positions of power to know things about what was going on at the university, and I know who in those positions who would be most apt to maybe help me out, maybe talk to me, maybe point me in the right direction. There was just a context there that, frankly, if I was parachuting in from, like you said, wherever, and having not gone to school here, I don't know what I would have done. And just one quick sort of short example is, I was telling Jerry this earlier, the night that Joe Paterno was fired, the Board of Trustees held a closed-door meeting, so it was not public. They didn't have to tell anyone where they were meeting. And at that point, we weren't exactly sure whether there was going to be a press conference afterward. Obviously, these people were going to be leaving this meeting, and we were going to hope to wrangle some time with one or more of those people, but we weren't sure if there was going to be this press conference. You guys all know how that story went. But I knew, okay, there's one of 3 places in State College that they're going to be meeting. They're going to be meeting at Old Main, which seemed likely to me at the time, the Nittany Lion Inn, which seemed less likely, and then the Penn State Conference Center, which in hindsight should have been most likely because it was the furthest removed from campus where everything was crazy, still news vans everywhere. If I was, like I said, parachuting in with no sort of context for this place, I don't know where I would have gone. So there was a sort of a stakeout with not only myself, but many reporters outside of Old Main. People started trickling away, and when they started realizing the trustees weren't here, so I said, okay, well, they have to be at the Penn Stater. I went there. As it turns out, they ended up announcing a formal press conference, and the whole thing was, was staged well. But as I was telling Jerry, had that not been the case, and had I been here, I would have been running around like a chicken with my head cut off.
Please, anyone that has a question, we'll get you involved right away. We've got people manning the microphones and also checking online. This question is for everybody. We could probably start with management, Jerry, but one lesson that we learned from the Duke lacrosse scenario roughly 5.5 years ago was that the rise and the use of social media was changing the rules of coverage. And where many news organizations, including yours, might have specific policies regarding the identity of accusers and or victims of alleged crimes, that it was becoming much easier to learn those identities. I mean, there was a wonderful column in the Duke Chronicle, a student paper, by a columnist who had heard the name and just Googled it to see what would happen, and realized that thousands and thousands of people were aware of this person's name, despite the fact that mainstream organizations were not printing it. Has that policy become obsolete, or is it becoming obsolete because of social media and the way that kind of information can travel now?
I don't know that it's become obsolete. I know, we know through reporting, Sarah knows, a lot of people know who these folks are. Sarah, better than any of us, I think, Malcolm, but I don't think so. I think newspapers have to all make a decision. I mean, I'm just going to speak for newspapers because that's what I do. I have to make a decision whether you want to print for instance, an alleged victim's name. And there's nothing, I mean, you can do it. This is not a legal thing. You can print someone's name if it's on a document or whatever. We can get it. Malcolm's right on social media, and social media, of course, has changed all of this. I mean, we all know that. But I think every newspaper's going to make a different call on that. We're making our call so far not to name any of the alleged victims of this. So may that change? I don't know. I remember being when I was a sports editor in the Bay Area of California before I moved to Pittsburgh in '04, and there was a young girl who was, I believe, was abducted down in the San Jose area, and some papers named her and others didn't, and we didn't. Even through this, and television had her, and we didn't. It's just what we did. I mean, I think it's every newspaper's policy. Personally, I don't think we should. I know it can be found out there. Well, then go find it. It's fine. That's what Google and other social media is for. If that's what you want to use it for, that's great.
Yeah, I shudder to think what mainstream journalism would look like if we do follow the lead of people on Twitter or Facebook or the blogs. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I love it. This is clearly our future, but I think to have standards and to keep those standards high, even if you're the only one in the room with standards, and to stand by those rules that are within the organization, I think that's the way to go. And I absolutely agree with USA Today and ABC News, some of the other people I work with, that doing the right thing by not naming the names of the alleged victims. In this case, the Syracuse story is different from the standpoint that they've come forward and talked to ESPN. But I think to keep our standards high, it's not easy, and it's going to get tougher in this world. And so many of you are journalists here. I want to be journalists here in the audience. And it's going to be tougher every day, as you described it so well, that world that is pushing in on us. But to keep those standards high, I think, is essential. And I still think it's absolutely the right thing to do. And knowing what's right is still a value that I think is important in journalism.
I've got a question for Sarah, and then we can start taking questions at the mics. So, please feel free. I mean, particularly those of you that are journalism students, it's what we do. So please take your places. Sarah, one question I had, you mentioned before how this started for you as a story about an allegation of a crime. When you look back on all this, is there a moment when it really became obvious to you that this whole scenario was passing through a threshold and that we were all in uncharted territory?
Yeah, but I think that moment didn't come for me until that press conference with the trustees that night, where, that was a press conference. I've never seen anything like that before, and it was just, I stood there actually at the end of it. It's a little embarrassing, but I thought, wow, I feel really dumb I didn't ask a question. And I just could not believe what was happening in that room. The way that some people were acting in that room, just the whole scenario was, you were there, it was unlike anything. It was not civilized. And I think that was the point where I realized if some of us in the media are even losing our grasp on the situation, then this is really, really big. And I think that was the point where that was like a turning point for me. But the next morning I kind of woke up and shook myself and said, you need to just go back to the basics. Go back to the things that you do every day, talking to crime victims, talking to people involved in cases and stories. Just go back to the investigative reporting that you've always done, because that's what this story is. At its core, every story has the same basic principles, and reporters have to do the same basic things to get the facts. And so I think it was easy to, overreact, and I didn't want to slip into that, even though I did let myself for 15 minutes just go, oh my God.
Well, but you were processing.
You had to process it, and you had to go back to it. And now after Thanksgiving break, where I gave myself like a whole 24 hours off, I'm starting to realize what this really means. But when you're in the trenches, like I didn't even see the nightly news for the first 6 days. I had no idea that this was leading national news for 6 days. straight. I knew that, there were trucks in town and that this was a big deal, but, I was just trying to stay focused and treat it like every other, because, the sad part about this is it's a horrible story for those 8 kids and their families. But this happens all the time. There are victims of sexual abuse every day. And there are stories like this every day that don't involve figures like these figures involved. So, to be honest with you, I've written this story, a couple dozen times. I'm sure I'll write it a couple 100 times more before, in the next, I don't know how many ever years I end up being a journalist. But it's really not different for them, for those victims, or for the people involved in the case, than it is for, other crime victims. I'm sure they're going through the same range of emotions. And that kind of goes back to that question that you asked about naming victims. I hear that all the time, especially in campus sexual assault cases. I used to hear that all the time. A frat brother, for example, would be accused of something, and all of the Greek community would rally behind him. They would send somebody out to the courthouse in Bellefonte. This would happen all the time. Go through the court documents or listen to the court testimony in that sexual assault case and get the name of the girl who had accused him, because it was public information. She did have to state her name when she testified or tell it to police. It was in documents. Many times I think that they already knew, because the reality of it is that keeping those people anonymous, you're really only keeping them anonymous to people who might read their name and wouldn't know them anyway. But you're not keeping them anonymous to the people who know. The people around them already know. But they would go to the courthouse, they would get the names, they would go back, and they would post it in the comment section underneath the stories. So even though your story doesn't say who that person is, it's right there on the news website.
Wow.
And it would be up there sometimes, all night, or for a few hours before someone would catch it, and it would come down, and a few hours later somebody else would create a new login and post the name again. And that happened countless times. So, going back to my original answer, I guess, this has been my mantra, but this is, on a much larger scale, a story that I write all the time.
If you could hold that thought, we have a question. Steve?
The John Wertheim's cover story in Sports Illustrated concluded with, "We are Penn State, but it means something different." My first comment is tonight's shows that to one extent we're still Penn State, which is the ability of somebody as nationally prominent and outstanding as Malcolm to put together a panel, and the fact that of this complete all-star panel, we have one long-standing all-star Hall of Fame friend and then 3 alumni, I think says something about the institution. The dominant narrative, and this is I'm inside, I want to take a breath like Malcolm said and get some perspective for those people who've been coming in. The dominant narrative, which the Wertheim piece reflects, is that the cover-up is a sort of a calculated decision to cover up a heinous offense for the good name of the university at the ultimate sacrifice of countless young men, which is just a horrific narrative that we're all reeling from. There's been a couple of pieces, a letter to the editor in the Center Daily Times and a op-ed piece in the Times, which raised the question, let's change the facts a little bit, and what do you think the reaction would have been? And one version is that Sandusky is seen on the football field in a completely non-sexual situation, beating the heck out of some little kid because he's completely lost his temper and he has severe anger management issues. And the second scenario is, what if he had been caught raping a 10-year-old girl? Do you think the reaction would have been the same? Now, if you read, they didn't answer it, but if you read Wertheim's story, Wertheim's answer is absolutely, it's the same. It's covering up a heinous offense for the good name of the university. The op-ed piece in the Times suggests that this is really a story about our very conflicted and uneven answers about homosexuality and pedophilia, and the discomfort that traditional older white middle class men have with that issue. And I'd really like to get the it's at least the columnists who can issue opinions, insight, is as to what their reaction to that is and what their sense is as to the basis of this dominant narrative that this is just a cover.
Any thoughts?
Sure. Great points and great question. I think I read that piece in the New York Times about it, what if this had been a 10-year-old girl in the shower? And I do think it would have been different. I don't know what everyone here thinks, but I really do believe that whatever Mike McQuarrie said he did or didn't do, depending on the grand jury or his later email that you reported on, Sarah, I think that he would have, and anyone would have, pulled Sandusky away from a 10-year-old girl. And it does go right to that point you mentioned, and I'm not an expert on this. I'm a sports columnist and deal with issues of our sports in our society and our culture. So I'm not an expert, but I think it begs the question about this confusion between pedophilia and in this case, as you mentioned, homosexuality. This notion that did Jerry, and again, this is all alleged, I realize that, as you said, we care about the victims, of course, first and foremost and always. Also, this is alleged, so I know you understand that I'm referring to things that we're not sure exactly what happened, and we will find out. But if, the idea that if they said, Jerry has this problem with little boys, and that was somehow laughed at, and we don't know the answer to this. But if that is, in the scenario you present, if that is part of our conversation, well, it's a good time to be having this conversation in the 21st century, because that means we've got a lot of people very confused about what homosexuality is and what pedophilia is. And I've covered a lot of college football, although this is my first visit ever to Penn State, which is kind of hard to believe, traveling the world covering sports. But covered a lot of college football, a lot of pro football. And there is something about a college football team atmosphere where you kind of go underground in July or early August, and you come up for air after the bowl game in January. And it is kind of like the 1930s or the 1940s in there. And you could see how that some old school thinking would get in the way of what should have been done, and if, again, the allegations are true. So I think you bring up a great point. I'm certainly not an expert in this, but I think these are questions that we as a nation should answer in this time of reflection and in this opportunity that we've been given to really, and university presidents especially, to look at what's going on these college campuses. Your point about the question about Jerry Sandusky pummeling a boy, and by that you mean a 10-year-old, right? Not a football player, right? Because Frank Kush did that for years at Arizona State, and others did. Woody Hayes did it and got fired, of course, in a game against an opponent in a bowl game at the Gator Bowl. So I think my sense there is the football players would have pulled Jerry Sandusky off of the boy, and maybe Paterno would have talked to Sandusky and said, what are you doing? You've got to stop that. And they would have made sure to get help from a trainer for that boy. I'm guessing, again, hypothetical situation. But I think it shows how football is so geared to understanding what it understands. And again, in this world of football where they're all kind of this alternative universe, I'm not so sure that they understand what's going on in the real world. And maybe this is this opportunity for all college football programs to start to understand the bigger issues that this story brings out.
We have an opening at that microphone. Please, take your place. And we have a question on this side.
Hello. Thank you. I was just wanting to ask the panel if they could actually articulate their view of what the threats or maybe actual impacts to Penn State's identity have been because of this story, and maybe what has surprised them, and if those impacts have been fair.
Sure. Well, again, I'm speaking as an alumnus partially here too. I think what has happened here in the past month will be a scar on Penn State for as long as Penn State is Penn State. I think that this is an indelible part of its history now. And I think what the university has to do, what Rod Erickson is charged with, what the trustees are charged with, is trying to, in some way, take something and build some, I mean, this sounds terrible, but try to build something positive from it. And if they can make that, you know, awareness for child abuse, if they can make that a cause, I think Penn State's going to have to do that, and I think the students are going to have to rally around and support that, much the same way that they rally around and support Thon. But in terms of what this has done for Penn State and Penn State's brand, I think it'll be a scar on the university for forever.
A related question, because we do have 3 alums up here. The Curley Center had a town hall meeting before break, because it became obvious that there were so many overwhelming feelings that the students were experiencing that we needed to talk about it. And one of the strong things that came out of that was that student journalists who were following their instincts and sleep deprived and doing all the things that they're being taught to do were racing through each day. But at the same time, there was this conflict with the fact that they were also Penn Staters. And a lot of students struggled with that because this whole experience is new for everybody. Was there a similar process that you went through where, I mean, on one hand, I remember Gene Foreman, who is a valued faculty member here for a long time. Jeremy, how are you? We'll explain this in a second.
Sorry.
Gene Foreman used a wonderful term in terms of how you report a story like this, and the term he used was deliberate speed, where you're going as fast as you can, but you're also taking time to assess. Have you been able to process what the story is doing to the storytellers in terms of, I mean, you're part of this fabric. I mean, you spent a lot of time here, and yet you have to be detached to report this story. Have you been able to process that yet?
I mentioned earlier, Malcolm, you know, anyone who read the grand jury report, which, again, another thing, most people don't read grand jury reports. This one, a lot of people have read, was readily made available. We had it up within an hour or so after it was gone on our website. But, you know, you read it and you read about the detail in it, and it's horrifying. And you know that the story isn't just this. You know as you read that report, this is going to have a reverberation that is going to go way beyond Jerry Sandusky, obviously. I think, and this is just my opinion, Christine's paid to give her opinion. I'm paid to keep my mouth shut sometimes, but I have an opinion on this.
Not here, Jerry.
Okay.
And
well,
you're
I
not
know.
paid either, by the way.
Yeah, I'm not paid. By the Post-Gazette I am. But here's my opinion. Sarah, you are the best person, I think, to answer this. Did you think you were going to see 40 counts? Did you think you'd see 2 sitting administrators charged with perjury in one shot? Did you?
You really want me to answer that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so you saw that coming. I wonder if the university did. That big, that much. And I wonder if that knocked it off its axis. And its response was not good. We know that. And we saw it. We covered it. It was not. And everyone who's covered the story can see that. This is not, you know, it was not done well, and it was not done right. But yeah, I think as a Penn Stater and someone who, you know, I mean, I didn't live in Pennsylvania for many, many years after I worked all over the country, but not here. You know, you have an attachment to Penn State. You go to school here. I got my education here. I worked at the Collegian. The Collegian helped me become what I am today. It's a big part of my life. And you read that, and your journalist in you says, wow, what a tremendous, you know, what a horrific but yet big, big, big story. Biggest college sports and college story you'd ever want to get your hands on. And at the same time, it's like it just sickens you to read it because it happened where you went to school. It's the school that you're always going to be tied to. I mean, you know, a lot of people you're a trustee at Northwestern. A lot of us stay tied to our schools in certain ways. I come up, and whenever I can help Malcolm out a little bit, I try. So there's a conflict immediately. I'd be interested what you guys think. It hits you like a jolt, but then it's like, okay, step back. What are we going to do next? What's the next thing to do?
Well, two-parter for this one. I understand what you're saying about Penn State maybe being a little shocked by what happened. As a reporter, I did a little math when they issued that statement, however. There was 40 hours, 40 hours, in between the time that those 40 charges were accidentally posted to that state court website. So remember, Jerry Sandusky was actually charged on Friday the 4th. He wasn't arrested until Saturday morning, but it was news at, I don't know, 3 o'clock on Friday. I mean, it hit the airwaves basically at 3 o'clock on Friday. So there was 40 hours in between when that became news to the university's first official statement. 40 hours is a long time. That's all I'm going to say. Now, as for my reaction personally, I've been taught, and you have to do this often, and I think that this applies beyond journalism to a lot of different career paths, but I can only speak for a journalist, because that's all I've ever been. You have to compartmentalize. Yes, I am proud to be a Penn State graduate. I'll tell you right now, I learned everything I know about journalism here, starting at the Daily Collegian, then with I shouldn't say starting with, but I guess my professors came first. And then the Daily, but really starting with the Daily
We do
Collegian.
appreciate that.
And the professors and the mentors. I mean, some of my professors will be lifelong friends for me. I adore the people in the College of Communications. I was so happy and so proud to teach Comp 260 in the spring, really. And if they asked me to teach again, I would do it. If someone asked me where I graduated, I say proudly that I graduated from Penn State. Yes, I feel that way. But when you are working a story, that is in a different part of my brain. And that's how you often have to work in journalism, not just when it does affect you, but when I go and cover a family whose house just burned down, they lost everything they own. Do I feel something for them? Of course I do. I'm a human being. Of course I'm going to feel. I think there'd be something wrong if I did not feel something for them. But you put it aside for a minute, and you're a reporter. And if that means at the end of the day, you got to take 15 minutes to vent to your boss, to vent to your mom, to vent to your significant other, that's what you do. But when you're reporting, especially when you're putting words on paper, when you're writing, you have to let it go. And I think that could apply to a lot of people involved in this story. Not just journalists, but maybe the people who work at Penn State too.
I would echo that wholeheartedly in terms of the compartmentalizing aspect of it. I think also, and I don't want to speak for anyone here, but those first few days, especially when the story was fast and furious, it was just, things were moving too fast. Consequential things were happening at such a rapid speed, I didn't have the time to really even sort of digest what was happening. It was just, you go, you do it, and frankly, the sort of debriefing time that I've had has been over this little Thanksgiving break I had. I got to go home after 18 nights here, and 18 lovely nights at the Spring Hill Suites on North Atherton. And
Was that a commercial?
Marriott, I love you.
I did teach him something. You already, excuse me one second, but I want to make sure we involve Jeremy. You already know his achievements because we handed them out. 2 things you need to know about him. He is really good at jumping through hoops because he had an experience today that I'm sure many of you have had. The Philadelphia International Airport got him. Bumped from one flight, canceled off of another, and got a car service to bring him here. So we appreciate your effort. But also, what I'm proud to say is that many moons ago on West 43rd Street in Manhattan, I recognized that the smartest guy in the room in the New York Times sports department happened to be a student from Cornell University whose job it was to answer the telephones. And I'm proud to say—
You were the only one.
Well, so you answering my phone calls, what is wrong with this picture? So, Jeremy, thank you for the effort. I mean, you have just come on the scene as part of the next wave of reporters of probably as intensely reported a story as any of us have experienced. How do you get your bearings when you're in a new place, you're trying to get up to speed, and it's a very competitive environment?
Well, it's obviously a challenging situation because the first I knew really about the story at all was on Saturday, and I was, just reading the stuff and astonished like everybody else. it frankly didn't even occur to me that, the next day I'd be in the middle of it. I happened to be having lunch on Sunday with Ellen Walsh, John Walsh's wife, whom many of you know. And, my phone starts going off. It's like, you got to get up there as quickly as possible. And you're thinking, oh, geez, State College. You can't get there from here. There's no way to get to State College, So
Little did you know.
Little did I
that's
know,
when
so-
things work.
Yeah, well, not so much actually. So I threw literally just like toothbrush and underwear in a bag, and there was a flight like in 30 minutes from the airport 20 miles away. So I get there, but they've already left the gate. The plane's still there, but they've left the gate. Now I've got to, wait 4 hours for the next flight. But I get here Sunday night, and, I'm trying to make as many phone calls as I can to people who are more familiar, who work for ESPN, with the college football world in general. I mean, I barely know at this point who Jerry Sandusky is, much less, everything that he's been accused of and his status in the community. So you just try to get up to speed with the help of your colleagues, really. And I flew here through Philadelphia with a producer. He was coming from Chicago. We met at the Philadelphia airport. We got here at about 9:45, I think, Sunday night. Went straight over to the stadium where we had our truck. And really, that night, produced one report, basically just kind of summarizing what had gone on. But at ESPN, and many places, I think, in sports more than other areas of the media, you're reporting, but you're also offering something that's kind of on the line with commentary. So you're doing more than presenting just the straight facts. You're kind of trying to imbue it with a little bit of your own thoughts about, in this situation, how college sports work, who Joe Paterno is. I mean, the one thing that was immediately apparent, I think, to anyone who was paying close enough attention, was that as horrific as the allegations are, and as shocking as it was to see the athletic director and the senior vice president of the university indicted, the story was about Joe Paterno, as far as what most of America cared about. And I think that's what we tried to communicate from the beginning.
So what was the internal conversation from the bosses that led everybody to that conclusion to drive that approach?
Well, I'm not sure that there was one. That was just my approach. I'm sorry, I can't. You'd think after all these years in I don't know if there was ever. I mean, there were probably a lot of meetings in Bristol. Chris, there are a lot of meetings in Bristol, period, on a daily basis. But when you're out in the field, you don't have a chance to take part in those, and you just kind of have to make decisions on the run. Literally land at the airport at 9:45. You got to get something on the 11 o'clock Sports Center that night, even when it's a football Sunday. And you just kind of have to make a decision. This is what I think the story is, and the producer agrees. And there's a script approval process, a vetting process, as you would hope there would be in any news organization. And over the course of the next several days, I was only here the first 2 days. And I believe I was only here initially because Tom Rinaldi, who's been here a lot more often than I have, was unavailable. He had some pressing business that could not be delayed personally. And, he's the college football guy. If it had been a baseball story, but I was basically filling in for Tom from the beginning. And then once I was relieved, as it were, on Tuesday, I kind of came home, and then I did ABC stuff. I did Good Morning America and World News Tonight. And what they were looking for from me was really more of kind of what I was talking about before, kind of a semi-informed commentary rather than straight reporting.
One question that comes as an outgrowth of that the traditional advantage that broadcast has had for an extraordinary story that would justify wall-to-wall coverage is the immediacy and the timeliness. Well, print outlets now have that capability. It's literally become a real-time exercise. Has that reality changed the way your broadcast outlet treats this? I mean, are you under more pressure now because you're
Infinitely. I
How
mean,
so?
Well, you don't have time, to digest things the way that you did 10 or 15 years ago. You don't have time to really give it the consideration that you would like or that you were accustomed to from the training you received. Or in my generation, Sarah and Mark, come from a different world. They grew up in a world in which, the first thing you did was turn on the computer. I mean, I don't think I'm that old. I mean, obviously,
Please don't say you're
yeah,
that
I mean,
old.
I was a copy boy when you were a columnist. So, but I mean, when I was applying to college, it was on a typewriter. That's how long ago. No word processor. I mean, you made a mistake, you ripped it out, and you started again. But back to your question.
So how has that training been tested with a story like this? When if you feel a little uncomfortable with what you're going with,
Well,
how
I'll
do you
tell
sort that out?
What's the most difficult thing when you're in the position, and I don't do it all that often. I used to. I've been working at ESPN for 18 years, and your roles change over the years. And what I do is less frequently the standing in front of a live position for 12 hours a day, regurgitating what you said in your last live shot, perhaps finding something in between to add to it. But that real-time immediacy makes it difficult to do the kind of gumshoe reporting that you would like to do. I mean, specifically that Monday, I woke up and I'm like, everybody's realizing, boy, this is something we have got to dedicate resources to. We've got to, fly in, the cavalry. And at the same time, I think I did 12 live shots that day, for shows I'd never heard of before, quite literally. And, it inhibits your ability to go out there and do the kind of reporting you want to do, and that's why you have many people doing it. But, that didn't exist, 10 or 15 years ago, and part of that is because ESPN is now on the air with SportsCenter basically 24 hours a day, and we've got all these other shows that we feed, et cetera, specifically at ESPN. But all of that is a reaction to the internet and to the fact that, you can't wait to put SportsCenter on at 7 p.m. like they did when I started working at ESPN, because by that point of the day, everybody's been on the internet for 5 hours and knows everything.
We have a question over here, and thank you for waiting. We'll get to you soon.
I was just wondering what you guys thought about how harsh the media was. I mean, that's how I took it, towards Joe Paterno, who I believe deserves more respect than we could ever give him, and how I believe they generalized a lot, like kind of linking Penn State with this like horrible crime and now we're awful, and I don't know, I just felt like the media lost sight of what the real story was, which is Jerry Sandusky and the victims. And I had a hard time like writing my papers in class. I would just like get really angry and start writing and be like, wait a second, you can't do that. So I was just wondering what you thought on that.
Any thoughts?
Well, as someone who has been very harsh on Joe Paterno, I'm happy to answer your question, and thank you for asking it. And I want you to know that for all of us who are writing or talking on air, whatever, about these issues, we think about that. I mean, it shocks people sometimes to hear we actually think about what we're going to do before we write or say it, but we really do. It's a surprise. And so...
Speak for yourself.
Oh, I know you thought once or twice. I've worked with you. No joking, but I do want you to know that we're very aware of that. As Jeremy said a few moments ago, because a few of us are sports journalists up here, we had to focus on the sports aspect of it. My work appears in the sports section of USA Today. Now, for ABC, I also, as Jeremy does, I work for ABC News, and that first night, and this, you may see this as harsh, but the first, it was Saturday, so by the time I was aware of what was going on, I was doing some sound bites for Good Morning American World News from Toledo, as I mentioned earlier, so from the affiliate there, and I actually said the words, if this is true, they all have to be gone. I'm very proud that I said that. 30 years of doing this maybe gave me that sense, I don't know, but I felt that. And so yes, does that sound harsh? But in this case, it wasn't forgetting about Jerry Sandusky, to let you in on the mindset of at least one journalist. It wasn't that at all. It was complete acceptance and acknowledgement of the victims and what I was reading in the grand jury report. But it was also the sense that I am a sports journalist, and so that is where this is what my job is, to look at it from a sports aspect. So Paterno was always the lead. What did Paterno know? When did he know it? And basic facts, what we knew from the grand jury testimony of Joe Paterno, that he said he knew about this, and we know that the police were not called. That alone is fireable to me at any university, frankly, at any institution of higher learning when you're dealing with young people. I know I sound strong here, but I couldn't be more forceful on this topic. That if you are a leader of young men and young women at a university in this country, or around the world for that matter, and you don't stop this from happening, and you have admitted that you knew and you passed it along, and we know Joe Pa's king here, so he passed it along to the athletic director. Well, he's, Paterno's in charge, we know that. That's just reprehensible and immediately a fireable offense in my book. And, but it's not forgetting about Jerry Sandusky, and it's not forgetting about the victims at all.
I would
I'm sorry, go
maybe
ahead.
like to add something. In my opinion, this is like an institutional story and an ethos that was created here. But as Jeremy pointed out, this story wouldn't have been the lead of SportsCenter, CNN, and Entertainment Tonight if it weren't for Joe Paterno. I personally don't think, as sort of cold as that is to say. I hope it doesn't come across that way, but I think that's just the reality of the situation. What Joe Paterno represented, not just to Penn State, but to college athletics, which has been, we've seen it over the past year, is really a cesspool in so many ways. And Joe Paterno had always sort of stood above that, and his identity was so tied to what Penn State is. He permeates the culture here, and he's influenced it in an inextricable way. I don't think the media was on a witch hunt, and I say this having not really, as Sarah said, I was in the same boat as her. I didn't get to read or digest or watch a whole lot of stuff while all of this was going on because I was busy working on my own stories. But at least I can tell you from where we were at, it was never a witch hunt to get Joe Paterno, to bring down Joe Paterno. I think if you look at the grand jury report and see the facts that are laid out based on people's testimony and what people knew, and which is a little bit murky still, but what people have admitted they knew, I think it just speaks for itself.
You have a question on this side?
I just wanted to ask Mark what he thought about the editorial that ran in the Patriot News recently, criticizing the treatment of the times of the victims described in the grand jury report.
I did happen to see that, and I'll start by saying I'm not a spokesman for the Times. They don't pay me to do that, so they've made their statement on it. I didn't report, write, or edit the story, so I hate to sort of skirt your question here, but I just don't feel like I have anything productive to add to the conversation. I'll say in general, I think when you're dealing with victims, and we were discussing this a little bit earlier, when you're dealing with victims in these sort of situations, I think as much information you can add to craft a compassionate, nuanced portrait of that person or persons, to get an understanding of what they've gone through, who they are and where they've been, without giving away details of who they might be, I'm for that. But I think there is certainly a boundary that shouldn't be crossed, and that's a circumstantial thing. So I'll say that.
Steve, the NMA has been monitoring the online. Thank you for bringing us into the 21st century. Steve, you have a question that you're relaying?
Yeah, this is from Twitter handle John Struble. So this is for our sports people. How will the allegations at Penn State and Syracuse, if at all, redefine NCAA policies? There are no current bylaws to address the alleged crimes.
That seems to be emerging as one of the more interesting big picture issues in this. I mean, any thoughts?
To me, it's a legal issue, obviously. The NCAA has always been, Malcolm, you covered them for years, and Jeremy, I know you've been, Christine, all you guys have at least touched on the NCAA in part of your work. They're a quasi-legal group, supposedly, but, I don't know that having the NCAA involved as far as writing specific, so what, if a crime occurs, I mean, let's say an athlete commits a crime, he's charged, or she's charged and convicted, well, does that mean that the NCAA then would put that program on probation? I mean, it's such a mess. I think the institutional control, which is the broad phrase that is used by the NCAA to kind of cap all of this, and I think it's unprecedented. Obviously, this situation is, but there was a situation at Baylor a few years ago. I mean, I think the NCAA, if they're going to start writing bylaws, that book is already about that thick, I think. I think that they have a role, but I'm not sure exactly right now what it is. I'm not exactly sure what their role is right now. If they're going to try to clean up college athletics, you needed to start that 100 years ago, and they're still trying to fix it.
Well, and if you think back to the summit that Mark Emmert called in August, which frankly feels like it happened about 20 years ago now. I mean, that was an issue that was being addressed. I mean, it was clear that there was a very difficult discussion on where to start in terms of meaningful reform.
I'm a little surprised that we haven't seen, I mean, I come from this, and I know it's been mentioned here, Mark, I think you mentioned it. I think this is, and Jerry too, I think without a doubt, this is the worst scandal we've ever seen in college sports. The Baylor one was murder. It's terrible. But I think because of Penn State, because of the squeaky clean image, Joe Paterno, all that we've discussed, the horrifying nature of the allegations, I think this is the worst scandal we've ever seen in college sports. And I think it may well end up being the worst scandal we've ever seen in sports, in U.S. sports, period. That we can certainly have conversations about that another day. But why haven't we seen, if it is that bad, which I think, at least I'm sure many of us agree, why haven't we seen 20 to 25 university presidents call a crisis conference and literally say, enough is enough? And whatever we end up finding out, and what happens to Jerry Sandusky and all the alleged victims, whatever the Syracuse thing is, isn't it time to say these programs are so out of control and so out of reach from the university hierarchy that it's time we really just say, this is awful and we've got to do something? We haven't heard that, we haven't seen it, and I'll bet you we won't. And here we got Urban Meyer signing a huge contract, and off we run with more college football.
A lot of people have mentioned, and it's true, Penn State football got too big. My question always is, well, who allowed that to happen? We all know how that happened. How much money does Penn State football make? How many programs does it help service? How much money does it bring into the university from very rich alumni and others and sponsors that have now, many of them, vanished? Who allowed that to happen? You're right, Christine. I mean, you would think that they would get together and say, my God, this is just horrible, we've got to stop it. And that's a perfect example. Urban Meyer, what did he get, $4 million, $5 million a year?
From a university that's in big trouble.
Right.
And by the way, in no means are we saying Urban Meyer's involved with Penn State or Syracuse, but it's just the same thing. It just doesn't stop. So, and Gordon Gee had the second dumbest comment by a university president ever, with I hope the coach doesn't fire me. That pales in comparison to the words, unfortunately, that Graham Spanier said here a few weeks ago. But and here we go. So maybe there is no huge watershed moment from this, which would be a shame, I think.
We have a question on this side, and we have a microphone free on this side.
Hi, my question is mostly directed towards Sarah. Maybe Mark, you can offer some commentary on this as well. It seems like so much of the breaking news in this story has been really based on the use of anonymous sources. what conversations do you and your editors have to decide when the use of these sources is appropriate? And do you think that the use of anonymous sources in any way affects the credibility of your reporting?
Well, I'll start with this. There's definitely a lot of conversations each and every time. And I know my boss is sitting somewhere over on that side of the room and will tell you that, especially back in March when we broke this story, there were entire days where I don't think I left her office. And I know the company lawyer very, very well. And, it's not something that we take lightly. It is definitely a thought process that each and every time we go through the steps to make sure it's something that we absolutely have to do. Does it affect the credibility of the reporting? I would hope that at this point that our readers would see that we have a track record, if not as an organization, at least on this story, for getting it right. And sometimes that means you have to protect people. And as a journalist, I protect my sources all the way. They come before me. I think that is the heart of the First Amendment. You have to. That's why we're in this business. I sell them out for nobody. And, the truth is the end goal. The facts are the end goal. Should somebody lose their job because they want to speak the truth? Should a victim have to give their identity for a story to be told? These are the questions that we have to ask. When that story ran in March, we had 5 completely independent people telling us the same information. It was all sourced, it was all on background, but it was 5 completely independent people. 5 people who I had spoken to, who I had assessed the credibility of, who I believed, and then there is a trust there. My bosses then believed me. So, and that's a conversation that we have every time. Is it ideal in a perfect world? Sure, in a perfect world, we would never rely on anonymous sources, but clearly, our world is not perfect.
I was going to say there's certain stories that merit the use of anonymous sources because the sensitivity of the topics are such that the information cannot be obtained another way. Would I like to have everyone on the record at all times? That'd be great. But this story was moving so fast and so complex, and I can just give you one example. On Monday night, after the arrest of Jerry Sandusky, my colleague Pete Thamel called me and left me a voicemail around 11:30 at night. I said, "Call me right back. Call me back immediately," or something like that, almost angry sounding. I was like, "Better call back Pete." He says, "I'm catching a whiff of something here, and it might be that Joe Paterno, this could be the end for him. Make a few calls." So it was midnight. I got 2 or 3 people on the phone, they woke these people out of bed, called 2 or 3 more people in the morning, got the information we needed. After 3, 4, 5, 6 drafts, we reported on our website that Joe Paterno was going to be fired as the football coach at Penn State. Let me tell you the conversations I had with my editors about a story like that. That's not something you really want to screw up, right? They were very, very sincere and intense about wanting to know what we knew, who we knew it from, and are you sure we can go with this? You're 100% sure? The vetting process was intense. And in terms of sort of credibility, the story was posted Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday night he was fired. So
I want to add one more thing to that quickly. A lot of the talk about this story has been about the secrecy of Penn State. I think that extends way beyond Penn State. I think that is the truth in a lot of organizations, a lot of universities, a lot of places where reporters like Mark and I are constantly running at full speed into brick walls and bouncing off. And, that speaks to, that's what we're doing. We're fighting that. We're about openness and getting to the truth, and a lot of times we're going against institutions that have built themselves around secrecy. It's not just Penn State, but I think that that was the case here. And so, you're not going to, let's face it, we were not going to walk into Graham Spanier's office and say, tell me what you know today. It's not going to happen. To get to the truth, sometimes you have to do that.
Related question for Jeremy. When you are becoming involved in an area that's not your area of expertise, and this is the kind of competition you're up against, I mean, how do you convince people that they can trust you privately with sensitive information? I mean, how do those mechanics work?
Well, one advantage we have at a place like ESPN is that people kind of know who we are going in. I mean, especially when you're dealing with people in the sports community. There aren't a lot of calls we make to people where they haven't seen us on TV, they don't have some idea of what our work is about, but it's still a challenge. I mean, if you don't know people, you have to try to find people who know the people you want to talk to, who in some way can vouch for you, so that when you make that call, you can say, I'm a friend of so-and-so, or so-and-so told me to call you. And obviously, in a story like this, there was a lot of reluctance from people that we do know with Penn State connections to use them in that way. Keep me out of it. But, I had conversations with, people like Matt Millen, for instance, frequently about, well, who are the people here I should be talking to? And if I leave them a message, can I tell them that Millen told me to call? And other people like that. And obviously it's problematic as well that we have so many people who work for ESPN who have been players here at Penn State. But in that situation, it's helpful. And, the rest of the time, you've just got to kind of rely on your charms or lack thereof and see how far they take you.
You've been waiting, I think, for a while. Oh, okay, well, please go ahead.
Okay, I was wondering, you guys had said earlier about every publication having to decide whether or not to name their victims, the victims of the case. I was wondering how you think it would affect it if I'm a graduate of a nearby high school where one of the alleged victims attends, and there had been some way that the students had found out, had bullied the student, and his mother had to pull him out of school because of the excessiveness of it. I was wondering how you guys felt about that, how it would affect a publication's decision whether or not to publish names, or how you guys felt about that.
Jerry, you're involved in those kind of discussions from an editor's standpoint. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, again, our policy is not to publish victims' names. We don't. If this happened, and this happened, you're talking about the Central Mountain
Yes.
case? Yeah. The unfortunate thing about this is a lot of times kids know. They do. I mean, in high school, something like this goes on, people know. One day, Sarah will write a book, and she will talk to all the people she talked to before any of us ever did or ever will. And how many people might have known that this happened to them? And in high school, we're raging socially and when social media and everything, we can do our part. And again, our policy at the Post-Gazette is not to publish the names of victims, but people are going to do what they're going to do. I read the stories about, the kid was, his mother had to pull him out of school. Hasn't he been through enough? That's what you say. But, I'm old and I've got 2 kids, so I think of, as a parent, hasn't he been through enough? But I don't know how else to resolve it. We do what we do. Other folks, every paper has their own policy.
We have a question on this side?
Yeah, this is like an open-ended question, like any of you guys. It seems like when this story broke, the biggest question media was asking is, what does this do to Penn State legacy? But my question is, isn't the worry about the Penn State legacy what brought us to this incident in the first place? So why hasn't the media attention turned to why have we been worried about the Penn State legacy? Why have we let these programs grow so high and above society, basically.
Well, certainly, from my point of view, that's really what I've been focusing on. And the Syracuse story, as tough as that is, but of course we all have been making the point, it is not Penn State. There's a common thread, but it's a very different story in terms of where it stands versus a grand jury report, all the things you know so well here. But, oh, absolutely, that is the common theme of everything, every radio interview I'm doing, every TV. We did it on World News, Diane Sawyer's World News last night. It's what you're doing. I think it's really, I guess, from your point of view, the good news would be that is the national conversation, I believe. And if, as you mentioned, Mark, can there be something good from this? I certainly hope there can be, and it's to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I think, this has been the conversation, strangely enough, for months leading up to what happened the first weekend of November here. That Monday, I moderated a panel in the Capitol building sponsored by John Conyers and Bobby Rush, two Democratic congressmen who would have held a hearing if they were the majority party. And for 4 hours on Capitol Hill, we heard people talking about why college sports is out of control. And the cover story in The Atlantic by Taylor Branch in October, which got a lot of attention, was about 20,000 words about why college sports is out of control. So I think people are talking about it, as Chris says. That's not the same, though, as it having any real impact on the 6 major conferences who really do most of the feeding of the phenomenon.
The question on this side, please.
Hi, I'm a Com 460W student, and my story for the entire semester has been Penn State football, so it's been my focus throughout the entire semester, going to all the games and learning about it, and this whole Sandusky scandal has really thrown a wrench into the whole thing, and right now I want to move into how this affects the football team, because today in Com 460W we read your editorial about whether Penn State should go to a bowl game or not, whether you wrote that it is a privilege and not a right, and I was wondering if you could, weigh in right now, why the students, athletes haven't earned it themselves, whether that the Sandusky scandal has anything to do with them, because the privilege is theirs because they earned it. They're the players. They did all the work. So I'm wondering if you could weigh in on that, and all the rest of you could weigh in on what you think about it as well.
Sure. Well, you have a very good point, and it's certainly the other argument, the other side of the argument that I made in my column in USA Today, which I stand by, of course. There's probably no surprise, but I totally respect your point of view. And my view is really simple. It's that, as we've said, and as I said, I believe we are seeing the worst scandal in the history of college sports, may well be the worst ever in U.S. sports history. If you take it from that point of view, absolutely, the student athletes, the football players, apparently, almost certainly, had nothing to do, had no knowledge of this. I completely agree with you. But a bowl game is a privilege, it's not a right. You go into a season, you don't know if you're going to a bowl game or not, of course. Although most teams go to bowl games, so you probably have a pretty good idea if you're a good team like Penn State is. It has been certainly this year. And that great start to the season that Penn State had before losing the last 2 of the three final games. So, but in general, a bowl game, if it were just, we talked about this with our group that we had, Malcolm, earlier, if the bowl game were just 2 teams on the field and the coaching staff and the band at halftime, if that were a bowl game, everyone goes, shows up, and then flies home, then I'd say just another game. I guess I'd still be against it because I think there are bigger issues here. But I guess I'd say, okay. My problem is a bowl game, as you well know. It's the Chamber of Commerce. It's the dinners. It's the Board of Trustees patting themselves on the back, and the university president, and the athletic director, and the staff. It's much more than just those student athletes. That's my perspective, and I understand completely yours is different. But with that in mind, the last thing I humbly believe that Penn State should be doing is celebrating football at this time, because I believe the scandal is so awful and is just unbelievably remarkable and something that will be remembered forever. I get that, Miami, of course, Miami of Florida, which is not known usually for leading the way in class and dignity, and I covered the Hurricanes in '83 when they won the national title, but they made that call. Different scenario from the standpoint the players some of them were involved in the particular scandal. But Miami decided not to go to a bowl game. As you know, Notre Dame off and on will decide not to go to a bowl game. There are a lot of reasons why schools don't go to bowl games that didn't impact the student athletes at all, and yet they still make that choice. So I strongly stand by that because I think that it would be a great statement by this university that this is such an overwhelming scandal, that we get it, that this is no nonsense, and that while we're sorry for the student athletes involved, this is no time to be celebrating football. It's a time to be knuckling down and focusing on the issues and the problems here on campus.
Question on this side, please.
Yeah, I'm sure you're all aware that Sandusky's trial is in a couple weeks, and I was just curious to get journalists' perspective on whether you think that the media has not only maybe jumped too soon, but have overexposed everything when Sandusky hasn't even been tried through the court system yet.
His trial isn't actually in a few weeks. His first court hearing is in a few weeks. I do see your point. I know that, this happens every so often. This happened, I think, in the Casey Anthony case in Florida, in Orlando, Florida, where you have a story with such magnitude, with so much interest.
Strauss-Kahn, Dominique Strauss-Kahn as well.
There's another one. The Duke lacrosse team, if you want to stick to the sports realm. But there are every so often, not really so often, I mean, Michael Jackson's doctor was one of them. Every couple of weeks, I guess, we get a story that a lot of people are interested in, and that it's almost like we're feeding each other. People want it. We know people want it. Even though they say they don't want it, these stories are always the top read. They're always the ones that people seek out the most. They don't want to admit to it, but it's the truth. And then we feed them what they want, and it's this back and forth, a circle, and it snowballs into this giant mammoth boulder that you cannot stop. And yes, it happens. Yes, I agree with you. It feels like it's been 2 years, and it's been 25 days. 25 days. We haven't even gotten to the first court hearings. So I agree with you in that sense, but I also think that, I think that the court of law is a completely different beast. It's amazing. It really is. We're involved in it, so we think that it's engulfed everyone's lives like it's engulfed ours. But what happens in a courtroom is so different than what happens in real life. It's almost like another world. You're like transformed into this. It truly is a different world in there. And I think that people will take it seriously. The lawyers are going to take it seriously. I think that they're going to find 12 people who will take it seriously. And we're not looking at a trial in 2 weeks. We're looking at a trial in maybe 2 years, maybe 10 years. I mean, it's really not an exaggeration.
Sarah, one related question. On a percentage basis, is there legally, is there any chance that for whatever reason there will not be a trial? Is that something that you've considered?
That's something that, a defendant drives that. If Sandusky wants to say, I'll go to prison for the rest of my life, of course, there will be no trial. This could end, and the crime track could end very shortly. I think that's a percentage-wise, probably a low possibility. His attorney has said that they're going to fight this to the end, and that's what I expect that they're going to do. But yeah, I mean, the length of a criminal justice, here's the thing. Our world has evolved very quickly. The journalism world, this 24-hour news cycle, this idea, I just actually had a strange case about social networking and judges. Like, should a judge be allowed to be on Facebook? It was basically a story that I wrote recently. First glance, you would say, why not? A judge should be allowed to be on Facebook. But, as fast as our world changes, the judicial world moves like an ant. I mean, they are incredibly slow. It's incredibly archaic. The rules that they have were the rules 200 years ago. So, what happens in that courtroom is very, very, very different from what happens in our day-to-day life. And I think that by the time we get to a trial, people are going to have settled a little bit. people are going to have step back and to see a big picture of what happened. I think we might have the end of some investigations, maybe the end of the Penn State internal investigation, the end of the Second Miles internal investigation, the end of an NCAA investigation, the end of the Department of Education's investigation. I mean, we could, and then even then, that's not the end, because then you're going to have civil suits. So if this is going to be going on for a long time. We're only
So
on,
in your professional estimation, how many years out realistically are we
oh my
talking?
gosh. I mean,
Well, because the reason I ask, you understand the process better than anyone else here.
I think we're going to be talking about this for 25 years.
Couple more questions.
So obviously this story sold, and it sold well, and of course how horrible the crimes was contributes to that. But as I said earlier, what really made this a big story was the people that were involved. And I think when you have people like Joe Paterno who are, nationally recognized, it can very quickly turn into something that resembles a witch hunt. And
Do you have a
news-
question?
What's that?
Excuse me, do you have a question?
Yeah. And news can ending up more like a tabloid. If you have seen the cover of the recent Sports Illustrated, looks more like a tabloid than it does, a sports journalism publication. But my question being is, at what point do you stop and say, yes, this sells well, but we've already reported on all the information, so let's stop and hang back on it rather than providing our, not necessarily our opinion, but our speculation. A lot of the speculation brought a lot of negative attention to the school, brought down our reputation, and may have, negatively affected people who all the details of their actions aren't necessarily out yet.
We are not at that point yet.
Yeah.
No.
I don't think we're even at the tip of the iceberg about the facts of this
you
case.
barely tapped it.
What speculation?
Just specifically, like we'll say Joe Paterno. I'm not necessarily coming out in open defense of him, but all the investigations, like internal investigations at least, about Penn State have yet to be.
Yeah, but I'm asking you, what did the media speculate about that you think has not been borne out or that was unfair?
It wasn't anything, there weren't specific things, but I felt like in between each of the news coming out, it was constantly all day hearing about this. Like in between each development, like the Board of Trustees and their press conferences and stuff, it was all everybody trying to figure out how will this affect Penn State, how will this affect Joe Paterno's legacy, and all the talk about it may have hurt our Penn State's reputation more than if the journalists just waited until the facts were out to report on them. I feel like the fast pace of social networking and 24-hour news cycle contributes to that, jumping on things before the details are necessarily there. And it can have a negative effect. And if you guys think it's a negative effect, you're the professionals on.
I mean, I think that you would be asking us a very similarly worded, but on a different side of the spectrum question if we hadn't covered it. I think we'd be getting a lot of criticism if we had said, oh, we'll just wait and see what what happens. And I'm not saying that anybody jumped to any conclusions, but that story was literally minute to minute. Like, usually you have one event where something happens and you have kind of like, it's like an earthquake almost. You've got these aftershocks, but they're smaller than the one event. In this case, we had, for 7-8 days, every hour, something happened that was unimaginable and bigger than what happened the last hour. And the last hour, you thought that was the biggest thing that could possibly ever happen. So I don't think that you're correct here that we just filled the time talking about what we thought might happen, because literally news was breaking that fast. Do I think that I forgot the second part of your question.
I
but
think it's also important in something like this to also place it in context, and I think that those conversations aren't necessarily a vehicle to push any agenda as bringing down someone or building someone up. It's to sort of assess where we're at. So, you know, now that we have this grand jury report, right, that Joe Paterno says he heard that there was something sexual in nature happening involving Jerry Sandusky in a shower. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean for Joe Paterno? What does that mean for Penn State's football team? I think that's sort of placing it into context. What we know at this moment in time, what does that mean?
To some extent, not having that conversation is kind of what got us here in the first place. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Saying that we can deal with, as a Penn State alum, saying that forget the outside world, we deal with our problems internally. Isn't that what got us here?
Absolutely.
It's also, I mean, not the role of journalists to sit back and wait for Penn State to come to some kind of internal conclusions about what's gone on. You know, as Sarah said, that's kind of what got us here to some extent. And the role is the opposite of that in some ways, you know, is to keep pushing the story, to push for answers, to put pressure on people so that they have to respond. That was, I think, you know, what was so disturbing to so many people right from the get-go that Sunday night, the day after, you know, so much news broke, that Joe Paterno issued, you know, that statement. And clearly his hope was, all right, I've issued my statement, I'm done with it, I don't want to talk about this anymore. That's not good enough. But, you know, the media's role is to keep pushing. Now, there was supposed to be a press conference, what was it, 2 days later, right? And, you know, do you think it would have been the appropriate thing to do for people just to ask him about the Nebraska game, you know, and wait for other stuff to come out? I don't think so, and you don't think so.
I think it also, to get to your question a little bit, there are different layers of media now. There aren't just newspapers, there aren't just television stations. There's Facebook, there's Twitter, there's blogs, there's talk radio. So if you're listening, let's say, for instance, to talk radio, and I don't want to knock those guys, but they have a job to do. They're supposed to pull ratings in. They have a job to do. That's what they do. So if they go on and say, I don't want to talk about Penn State today, how about talking a little, you know, Oklahoma football? Well, no one's going to listen to it. So, but if you listen to that for 4 hours and say, that's where I'm getting my Penn State stuff, then you're going to feel that, yeah, these guys are ripping us apart. If you're a Penn State student or a Penn Stater. But I think there's so much media out there, and I was telling Malcolm this earlier today.
I'm glad you make.
Yeah, Richard Deitch, who's the SI media writer, tweeted the other night a reminder: follow the reporters, not the analysts. Reporters. They're out there. They're fact finding. That's what they're doing. Hey, whatever the facts are, they, you know, if they can vet them and they know it's true, they're going to report them. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read columnists. It doesn't mean you shouldn't read blogs. It doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to talk radio. But you have to remember, there's a big world out there. And, you know, a lot of people might be trying to shine the light different ways, but it's really up, if you shine it, people will find a way there. So if you're going to take all that in, you have to take it all in, and you don't want to broad brush media. I was interviewed for a story for American Journalism Review, and I said I thought the coverage of Penn State had been fair. I do. I still think that. I think the reporters who have covered this story have done it as fairly as they possibly can with what they have. Have people been fair who maybe have been very opinionated on it? Maybe not, but it's their opinion, and you can take that for what it's worth. You can, you know, everybody's got, it's the old phrase, everybody's got an opinion. Well, I'm not going to go, it's kind of a dirty thing to say, but you know, everybody's got an opinion, and you know, and you can believe the ones you want, and you've got your own opinion. You can believe that too.
Well, also, I think, with all due respect to the question, I actually completely disagree with the premise. If Penn State had handled this better, I mean, Penn State, every chance that the leadership of Penn State had to make a choice between making the right turn and the wrong turn, they made the wrong turn. And so they basically begged for, they didn't, of course, but it called for the media to come in and I think save the day. You know, often we journalists...
I completely agree.
Pardon me?
I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, I don't think Penn State would have handled it well without the media just on their own. But I just wanted to see what you thought about covering it before official word came out.
Yeah, well, again, I think that, we're down there, our reputation often is down there with used car salespeople. And I got to tell you, I think this is a fine moment for journalism. It's a terrible moment for Penn State's leadership, and hopefully Penn State will see a better day. But in terms of the journalists coming to the fore and doing the right thing, you guys have just been remarkable. And I'm so proud of our profession. And for what you've done, especially Sarah, you, in breaking the story, it's just fantastic. And the nation knows that. And so there are things to be proud of at Penn State, and it's your journalism department, especially right now, and those who've come from that journalism department, including these wonderful people on my right. And a last quick thought, you mentioned early on in your comments about it sells, the story sells. I think I can safely say that the 6 people sitting up here, Malcolm for many years, on our side of the business now, of course, in academia, we have never thought of selling a newspaper. We've never thought of a TV rating, ever. In my entire career, I have never thought that a story might sell a paper. And I know that probably is shocking to almost all of you in the room. Other people think those thoughts. That's the business side. That's the advertising side. Church and state, you hear that? There is that wall in our business. And I'm pretty sure all 6 of us have never, ever for 1 second had the thought of selling a newspaper or what is the TV rating for this show. We're just doing our jobs.
One last question, please.
Thank you very much.
Sarah, you reported the Sue Paterno incident for the Harrisburg Patriot News on a broader scale. My question for all of you, what do you think will and should be the relationship that Penn State has with Joe Paterno going forward in the wake of the scandal?
Well, I think that Rodney Erickson said something, and now I can't remember what day it was, but it was sometime in the last 2 weeks, when questions and rumors started arising about the statue coming down over Thanksgiving break. He said something that really struck me. He said, Joe Paterno is going to be honored by this university for what he's done, but now is not the right time. The Monday after, maybe it was Tuesday after the arrest, I was here. Had just actually come back to town after a meeting with my bosses, and was asked to speak to the journalism covering Joe Paterno class. Is that what it's called? It's a class I'm sure you've heard of about covering Joe Paterno. And I asked the group, this is before the Nebraska game, what they were thinking. Were they going to go to the game? And it was this overwhelming, I took it as this overwhelming feeling to defend themselves. They were very, very defensive. And I understand that. As a Penn State grad, you don't want your alma mater you don't want this to happen to your alma mater. Nobody does. We want to have this idealistic image of, and be proud of where we came from. But I think where everyone went wrong was taking that to a level of worship. I have family from Ohio. Nobody worshipped Jim Tressel like they worshipped Joe Paterno, like people here worship Joe Paterno. I think that could be said in a lot of college football programs. I think we have to be careful and learn a lesson from this. And this is not Joe Paterno's fault. I don't think that he necessarily asked for that. But you can't worship other people. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to you. Because when you put someone up there on a level that's godlike, then you're you're giving them the standard that they can't ever make a mistake. And that's what I got from that class, was it can't be true because he's Joe Paterno and he does no wrong. The guy's a human being. How could any of us really say what we would have done in his shoes? We all say what we would have liked to have done in his shoes, but when you worship somebody like that, you're not being fair to yourself and you're not being fair to them. So, I don't know. When I was a student, if you had told me that the way that Joe Paterno would go would be this way, I would have absolutely said you were crazy.
Do you think the university will continue to...
I think we'll heal from this a little bit, and yes, I think that everyone will give him as much or as little as he deserves. I think that that will take time, but I hope that we all learn that lesson from this.
When an absent friend used to host the sports reporters on Sunday mornings, the panelists would give a parting shot. I mean, we could call them final thoughts. I mean, I invited you if anybody does have a thought or something you didn't get to say, just briefly some aspect of this, and thank you for your attentiveness and going as long as we have. I mean, you've been wonderful. Any final thoughts?
The one thing I wanted to say, and I said this in ESPN commentary, I did, and it's probably something that's become clear to all of you, if not earlier, then certainly over the course of the last few weeks. But I think everybody in the business of covering sports has to get out of the habit of equating success on the field or on the sidelines as a coach or as an athlete with strength of character. And it's a habit that's difficult to break, and it's a temptation we often fall into. But I think the Joe Paterno situation, if you will, is illustrative in that sense. And I was thinking about it a few weeks ago when Mike Krzyzewski broke the all-time wins record for men's coaches in Division I basketball. And I was hearing so many people say so many wonderful things about Krzyzewski, who I happen to like and respect. But ultimately, I barely know him. I mean, I've probably been to 100 games that he's coached and been to 100 press conferences and done one-on-one interviews with him, even, for hours cumulatively. But that night, people are talking about what a wonderful guy he is and all the things he does. And it struck me that it was similar to Paterno. Here's a guy who is maybe the closest analog in his sport, or will be at least as he gets a little bit older. But, we give guys so much credit, particularly as coaches, in this day and age for, not being completely dirty and for showing some kind of modicum of interest in the welfare of your players. The things that you would think would be absolutely mandatory and the minimum that we expect are now celebrated. And it was something, less than 2 years ago, right at this time, we were starting to learn about Tiger Woods. Here was a guy, it wasn't good enough for people to say, here's the greatest golfer who's ever played. We had to turn him into a Nobel Peace Prize candidate, a guy who could do amazing things for the people of the world. And the fact is, we didn't know anything about him except that he was a really good golfer. And it struck me again the other day. I was watching the Nebraska-Penn State game, like most Americans, it seems. And Penn State had a nice second half, I guess. And, I heard commentators saying that it showed a lot of character, that they came back from a lousy first half to play with so much heart and dignity, et cetera, against Nebraska in the second half and score, I guess, 2 touchdowns. I'm thinking to myself, it doesn't show anything of the sort. It shows that they played a pretty good half of football, but it doesn't speak to their character. It doesn't speak to who they are as people. It doesn't mean that they're bad people, obviously. They're not mutually exclusive, is what I'm trying to say, strength of character and success in sports, but they're not mutually inclusive either. And I think that's something we should, it's very tempting. It's very tempting to fall into that trap. But that's one of the lessons here for people like you and us.
As the person sitting up here who's probably been the toughest on Penn State over the last 3 weeks, and my columns and the words I've said, I also want to say something else, that all of you have a great opportunity. The nation is watching you, and what will happen here during the time you're here in school, those of you who are not in school but are interested members of the community, all of you have a wonderful opportunity before you. And that is to do this right, to take this awful thing, which we have described over and over as this terrible, awful, worst thing we've ever seen in sports kind of scandal, and turn the result into something good. What is that? You know how I feel about a bowl game. Whatever happens there, we move on from that point. But I also think it's making sure you hold the Board of Trustees to their feet to the fire. If they all have to go, they all have to go. If there has to be complete house cleaning among, of course, the football coaching staff, I guess we all think that may happen. That's what has to happen. If it's the governor ends up leaving, the governor goes. I have no idea. But I don't think anything should be, but we should, I know we laugh, but I mean, right?
No.
Anything.
It's that nervous laugh.
Yes. But I think you're rewriting history here. This is your opportunity, you and your colleagues and your peers and the millions of people like you in Pennsylvania who care very, very much. I think the nation knows that most students on the night of the riot and the overturned TV truck, that most Penn State students were where they were supposed to be. You were in your dorm rooms, you were in your apartments, you were doing the right thing. And that several thousand, what have you, students started to make a different name for Penn State that night. And 2 nights later, you reclaimed your name back with that wonderful candlelight vigil. So even those of us in the media who are very critical, and I'll wave my hand and admit that I am, also know how good Penn State is and what a wonderful university you have and the great things that will happen here starting the moment you leave this auditorium. So good luck to you. Do it right. Hold the authorities to the highest standard possible and make sure that some really good things come out of this horrible story. Good luck and congratulations on your future success.
I'll speak a little bit from a personal standpoint. The Jerry Sandusky story broke. The grand jury report was out on a Friday, I believe, and Sarah, somebody will help me, and it was a Friday. That Thursday night at about 11:45, because my son Daniel does everything late, we punched the button that said, yes, I'm applying to Penn State. We visited Ohio State, Maryland, and American University. He liked it here. He wanted to come here. On Monday, I have dinner with him. I say, now, Daniel, we've been reading what's going on at Penn State the last couple of days. He goes, yeah, Dad, I have. We're talking about it on Facebook. We're talking about it on Twitter and everything. I said, now, look, you don't have to be compelled to go there. It's going to be a rough time for the university for the next few years. There's going to be a lot going on. I understand. This is not a kid who's, goes to football games a lot and stuff. But he said, you know what, Dad? I said, you'll be the first class after this scandal that comes in, at least after the breaking of it, that comes in. And he said, you know what, Dad, maybe we can change things. Wow. I was so floored. I'm like, God, your mom taught you really well, because you couldn't have gotten that from me. But, here's the point, and it'll piggyback a little bit on what Jeremy and Christine said too. I think there can be change, but it really has to start with the students. I think the university is an entity, but the students are what make it, in my mind, and it always will be. Even if you only spend 4 years here, or some of you are 2 and 2, I was a 2+2 student. As a matter of fact, my first class is an undergrad at University Park, right here, Biology 11. How'd
you do?
8 o'clock in the morning, not well. But I mean, anyway, I guess my point is, you can affect change, and Penn State can affect change. Penn State's a great school. It's not done very well here, not at all. From the football program to Old Main, you can pick off a lot in between that it didn't do right. So now you have to make it right. But that comes from students. It starts there, and they got to work it, and you got to work it hard. Not just journalism students, student body, student leaders. Hold people accountable. Christine's exactly right. This happened because no one was accountable. No one felt accountable. And they all were. They all were. So students, you be accountable. You push your professors. Push guys like Malcolm.
Oh, they do.
That's it.
Oh, they
Push
do.
them. Push administrators. Make it more open. Because when it's more open, everybody can see. And when it's not closed and it's in the dark, you can't do things in the dark. Unfortunately, and Sarah will probably talk about this, and a lot of this case went on in the dark. A lot of what happened to those people.
We know how you feel. We can come back, hold that thought. Sarah?
It shouldn't have happened. Make sure it never happens again.
Thanks, Jerry. Sarah?
I'm going to change courses a little bit. only because I always get a knot in my stomach before I ask this question, but I want to know. How many of you, by show of hands, are journalism majors? Oh, wow.
Very good.
Good. Okay, here's what I want to say. This is my final thought. It has nothing to do with the scandal. If you want to be a journalist, be a journalist. I don't want you to be discouraged by people who are going to tell you that it's a dying business, especially people who want to be in print. I don't want you to be discouraged by people who are going to tell you that we are overly opinionated these days, that social media is ruining the business, that it's causing us to lose our morals, our standards, our ethics. It's not true. You make it to a newsroom and you will find out that it's not true. And that's what I want you to do. If you want to be a journalist, I want you to go out and start being one. Get an internship, start getting clips. Be proactive about it. Don't think of yourself as a broadcast major or a print major or someone who wants to be on a photography track or someone who wants to be a columnist or someone who wants to be in sports. Do everything. Because what I do from day to day, yes, I write. I'm a reporter. I ask questions. But I am not just a print reporter. That's a horrible way to qualify it. I shoot video. I use Twitter. I used to do a lot of broadcasts, and then I somehow this week started doing that again. But I have a lot of friends who were in TV who did not just shoot video. They also had to write newspaper stories for their website. Some of them, their contracts would end and they would have to freelance newspaper stories until a contract came around again. You are on all platforms. That's what we have going forward. The best way to get your resume to the top of the pile is to make sure you know all platforms, and you know them all well. You know how to take a picture, you know how to shoot video, you know how to ask good questions, and you know how to write. Don't get into a one-track mind. The last thing I want to tell you is that I don't want you ever, ever, ever to listen to anyone who says, "How old are you?" "Oh, you're just a student?" "Oh, I'm not talking to you." The way that technology is changing our business, basically, no disrespect at all to people who have been in this business for a long time, means that it doesn't matter if you've been around for 30 years. It doesn't matter if you've been around for 50 years. What's happening right now, you know best. I guarantee it. You know better than Mark and I. Don't ever let anybody tell you you can't do it because you're young. Don't ever let anybody tell you you can't do it because you're a student. And make sure you work hard and make sure you're doing something that you love, because that is all that matters. At the end of the day, if you go home and you hate your job, you're going to be miserable at it no matter what. Make sure you love it. That's my final thought.
Thanks,
Very
Sarah.
good. I am going to speak to the journalism students and also just the students in general and even the alums in the room. I am an alum. I understand how much Joe Paterno meant to the university. I understand what this scandal has done to the university. It's the low point in over 150 years. And I also understand that the reputation of the student body, as much as the institution itself, has taken a beating because of what the outside world saw. And maybe a lot of people didn't necessarily understand where you were coming from when you were expressing whatever you had to express, when you were, going downtown after the firing, when you were going to Joe Paterno's house. I get that. I get all that. But I think the thing that everyone has to remember is, at least when I look back at my college experience, I don't think of football games. I mean, I think of them in sort of an abstract way, but they were just a part of it. I don't think of Joe Paterno. I know that sounds crazy, but he's not the first thing that comes to mind when I think of my Penn State experience. Penn State is more than a football coach. It's more than a football program. It's more than a ranking in a magazine. It's more than a bunch of buildings on this Norman Rockwell campus. It's you. It's your professors. When I think back to my college experience, the things that come to mind are the friendships I formed, the bonds that I made with professors, with colleagues, with just friends, fraternity brothers, whatever. I think of tailgating. I think of, afternoons on Hub Lawn doing nothing, throwing around a Frisbee. I think of nights at the cafe having a drink or two.
You were 21
I
when
was
that happened. Right.
definitely 21 when that happened.
I wanted to check.
And that is what stands out about this place. I know it's a confusing, difficult time to be a student here because, I've been here the past few days and I've seen everything that's gone on. But don't let that change necessarily the way you feel about this place. It's going to change the way we view it a little bit, but in your heart, I don't think it should change the way the regard you hold for the place, because there's still a lot of really great people here, and there will be a lot of great people here, and that's what you're going to remember more so than who is the coach of the football team. So those are my 2 cents.
I get to go last, and I defer to our friend Dave Anderson because, with all due respect, the most precious piece of real estate in American sports journalism, even in his retirement, is when Mr. Anderson writes Sports of the Times. And he recently did a Thanksgiving column, and there were 23 items to be thankful for. 3 of them had to do with college athletics out of 23, which to me is as powerful an indictment on the state of intercollegiate athletics in a nuanced way as you could possibly have. Here's why that piece of real estate was so important to me. In a year when sports too often melted into scandal, it's even more important on Thanksgiving to remember those who deserve a thank you note, : the concerned Penn State students who organized a candlelight vigil for those who said they were sexually abused 2 nights after the downtown riot by less thoughtful demonstrators in State College, Pennsylvania. You are the shining light. Thanks for your attentiveness. Thank you for your honesty and your emotion. I'm grateful to you all. Thanks and good night.